She was buried upright in the snow, arms bound, mouth sealed with black tape, cold crushing her ribs like a fist. 3 feet away, her canine partner was in the same frozen grave, muzzle taped shut, amber eyes locked on hers, breathing steady, willing her to stay alive. An FBI agent and her German shepherd, swallowed by an abandoned quarry because someone inside her own team wanted them silenced. Miles away, a Navy SEAL and his dog were tearing through the drifts, but the clock had already stopped counting in her favor. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. Drop your city in the comments so we can see how far this story travels. If this moves you, subscribe and stay until the very end. The call came through the right channels. That was what made it dangerous. Not a burner phone, not a whispered tip from a parking garage. A properly routed intelligence brief, forwarded by a task force staffer who genuinely believed the information was verified, stamped, and clean. The kind of call that made an FBI agent lean forward instead of pull back. Nora Cafferty read the brief twice, then a third time. 32 years old, dark auburn hair pulled into a knot so tight it gave her a headache she hadn't noticed in hours. Gray-blue eyes moving across the text with the focused patience of a woman who had learned that the difference between good intelligence and a death trap was usually one misplaced detail. She found no misplaced details. That should have been the first warning. "Coda," she said. Not a command, just his name. The 5-year-old sable German shepherd lifted his head from beside her chair and looked at her with amber eyes that held no opinion about the brief, only attention. Deep charcoal to copper coat, broad chest, ears permanently angled toward whatever his handler was worried about. Coda didn't read documents. He read Nora. And right now, Nora's heartbeat had changed rhythm by 3 beats per minute, which was enough for the dog to go from resting to alert without being told. "We might have a drop location," Nora said. "Evidence on the supply route. Coordinates, timing, the whole package." Coda's ear twitched. Not at her words, at the tension underneath them. The Joint Task Force had been sitting on Crown of Pines for 23 days. 23 days of negotiation, phased warrants, controlled supply deliveries, and the grinding patience that kept a suspected explosive site from becoming a headline. ATF led, HSI supported. Nora was the FBI liaison, internal integrity, evidence chain, and the human conscience of an operation that was running out of political patience. Crown of Pines called itself a faith-based wellness retreat. It was a trafficking pipeline wrapped in hymns. Nora had known that since Rachel Voss walked into Pastor Jim Sutton's church 3 weeks ago with borrowed shoes and a story that made Nora's blood go cold. Rachel, late 30s, thin in a way that meant skipped meals, blonde hair stuffed under a knit cap, eyes that kept checking exits, had been inside the compound for 11 months. She'd been allowed out for errands, small freedoms designed to look like mercy until you realized they were control with a ribbon on it. Rachel had walked into the cold with groceries in her arms, felt the sky above her for the first time in nearly a year, and decided she'd rather die running than live kneeling. She hadn't gone back. That testimony had given Nora the foundation, but testimony without physical evidence was a case built on sand, and Nora had spent 23 days trying to harden that sand into concrete. Now the brief was offering her exactly what she needed. Evidence drop, supply route confirmation, location and timing. She didn't trust it, but she couldn't afford to ignore it. "Cafferty." The voice came from behind her, and Coda's reaction told her who it was before she turned around. The dog didn't growl, didn't stand, just went still. A subtle rigidity that ran through his body like current through a wire. The same reaction he'd had every single time this particular person came within 10 feet. Mason Hales stood in the doorway of the command post with his clipboard, and his contractor's parka, and his clean-cut smile that never quite reached his eyes. 38. Average height. Neatly trimmed hair. The kind of face that could smile at you while calculating how to use you. "Heard you got the route brief," Mason said. "Need logistics support on the approach?" "I'm still reviewing it." "Smart, but the window's tight. If the drop happens on schedule, we've got maybe 18 hours before they rotate the cache." "I'll flag it." Mason nodded. Friendly, helpful, exactly the kind of man who made himself indispensable by being everywhere at once. He glanced at Coda, and something flickered across his face. Not fear, but the awareness of being measured by something he couldn't manipulate. "Your dog doesn't like me much," Mason said. Light. Joking. Nora looked at Coda. The dog's amber eyes were fixed on Mason's hands, specifically on the clipboard, on the way Mason's fingers rested near the edge where the supply transfer logs were clipped. "He's particular," Nora said. Mason laughed. It sounded rehearsed. He walked away, and Coda didn't relax until the man was 30 feet gone. Then the dog exhaled, a long, controlled breath that sounded less like air leaving lungs and more like a judgment being filed. Nora knelt beside him. "I know," she said quietly. "I hear you." She found Ethan Cross at the north edge of the command perimeter, reviewing terrain maps with a focus so complete that even the cold seemed to avoid interrupting him. 30 years old, short, dark brown hair, lean and hard-muscled in his NWU Type 3. The digital camouflage of green and brown that made him look like something the forest had produced, rather than something the military had trained. His face carried the controlled stillness of a man who had learned to make his expression a locked door. Shadow sat beside him. Adult German Shepherd, brown and tan, with a black saddle so dark it swallowed light. Eyes that held the deep, patient intelligence of a dog who had seen combat and decided that the only opinion worth having was his handler's. Shadow wore a plain leather collar, but his tactical harness was within arm's reach in the vehicle. Always within reach. Because Ethan Cross was a man who had arrived 90 seconds too late once, and he'd spent every day since making sure everything he might need was close enough to grab without thinking. "The brief looks clean," Nora said. Ethan didn't look up from the map. "Too clean?" "I don't know yet. That's the problem." Now he looked up. His eyes were calm but sharp. The eyes of a man who had spent years making life-or-death decisions in environments where every piece of intelligence could be real, or could be the last thing you ever trusted. "Where's the drop?" "Quarry Road, north of the compound. Dead zone for cell and radio signals." "I know that stretch. Signal dies about 2 miles in. Doesn't come back for another 3. The brief says the evidence cache is at the old gravel site. Timing is tomorrow afternoon." Ethan was quiet for a moment. Shadow shifted at his side, reading his handler's silence the way a compass reads magnetic north. "Who sourced the brief?" Ethan asked. "Routed through a task force staffer, standard channel." "Who originated it?" Nora paused. "I'm still tracing that." "Trace it before you drive into a dead zone alone." "I wasn't asking for permission. I wasn't giving it. I was giving advice." "There's a difference." Their eyes held, not hostile, not warm. The careful, testing contact of two professionals who respected each other's competence, but hadn't yet decided how far that respect extended. "Your dog reacted to Mason again today," Nora said. Something behind Ethan's eyes shifted. Subtle. Painful. The grinding of loyalty against instinct. "Mason and I served together. 4 months in the Gulf. Logistics support." "I know." "He was efficient, reliable, never caused problems." The best infiltrators never do. Ethan looked at Shadow. The dog looked back at him with dark eyes that offered no opinion, only readiness. What do you want me to do? Watch him. Don't engage. Just watch. If Shadow reacts to him the way Coda does, I want to know. Dogs aren't admissible in court. No, but they don't lie. And right now, that's worth more than anything on paper. Ethan nodded once. The conversation was over. But something had opened between them. A thin corridor of trust, built not on warmth, but on the shared recognition that the threat might be closer than either of them wanted to believe. That evening, Pastor Jim Sutton called Nora from the church. His voice was careful and low, the voice of a man who weighed words the way a jeweler weighed stones. "I've been thinking about those sermons," Jim said. "The ones Rachel described. Elias Crane's language. It's not scripture. It's code." "Give me examples." "The cellar where the old spirits rest. That's a storage zone, probably underground. Lamps that must never go dark. That's surveillance. Someone's watching something around the clock. And there's a phrase he repeats. Sealed rooms where the faithful wait. Nora, those aren't metaphors. Those are locations." Nora felt the pieces clicking together in her chest. The sensation she got when a case shifted from fragments to architecture. "Can you mark them on a map?" "I can try. I've been to that compound for interfaith meetings before they shut outsiders out. I remember the layout." "Jim, if you help me with this, you become involved." "I became involved the night Rachel knocked on my door. I just didn't have a map to prove it." Nora hung up and sat with the phone in her hand for a long time. Coda pressed against her leg, warm and solid, the steady anchor that kept her from drifting into the kind of doubt that paralyzed rather than protected. Then Hazel Briggs called. 64 years old, voice like gravel wrapped in velvet. The diner owner who had been tracking suspicious vehicles on receipts because nobody else was paying attention. "Honey, that truck came back tonight. Same time, same route. But it didn't go to the compound. It went north, toward the quarry road." Nora's blood cooled. "You sure?" "I'm standing at my window watching the taillights disappear. Same truck, same plates I gave you last week." And the bed was loaded heavy, sitting low on the springs. "Hazel, I need you to write down everything. Time, direction, plates, load estimate." "Already done. I'm looking at it right now. Written on the back of a pie receipt, because that's what I had. You want me to bring it over?" "Keep it. Lock your door. I'll come to you." Nora hung up and stared at the wall. Two pieces of intelligence, from two different sources, pointing at the same location. The brief. Hazel's truck. Both aimed at the quarry road. Both arriving on the same night. Either the case was breaking open, or the trap was closing shut. Her phone buzzed again. Unknown number. She opened the message. 4 words. No sender ID. "Stop digging. The snow is waiting." Coda's head lifted. He stared at the phone in Nora's hand, then at her face, then at the door. A sequence so deliberate it felt like language. His body tensed, his ears pinned forward, and the growl that formed in his chest was low and old. The kind of sound that didn't come from training, but from something deeper. An instinct coded into the species before humans ever learned to lie. Nora looked at the message. She looked at Coda. She looked at the quarry road marked on the map pinned to the wall. Someone inside the task force was feeding the network their evidence timeline. Someone who knew which channels Nora trusted. Someone who could build a tip so clean it looked like truth, and deliver it through a real human being who would never suspect they were carrying a weapon. And that someone had just told Nora exactly what was waiting for her if she didn't stop. She picked up the phone and called Ethan. He answered on the first ring. Cross. I just received a threat. Anonymous. Tied to the Quarry Road location. Silence. Then, how specific? Specific enough to reference the terrain. The snow is waiting. Someone knows I'm looking at that road. Don't go. If I don't go, whatever's there stays hidden. And if whoever sent this realizes I'm onto them, they burn everything and disappear. Then I go with you. You can't. If we both vanish into a dead zone, Mason has a free hand inside the command post. One of us stays inside the system. Another silence. Longer. The silence of a man calculating odds and not liking what the math was telling him. Shadow must have read it, because Nora heard the dog shift, the soft click of claws on a hard surface, the sound of an animal moving closer to his handler, because the air had changed. Set your check-in window tight, Ethan said. 15 minutes, not 30. And if you miss it by 60 seconds, I'm coming. Understood. Nora. His voice changed. Not softer, deeper. The voice of a man who had lost someone to a 60-second margin once, and had rebuilt his entire life around never letting it happen again. Come back. Nora looked at Coda. The dog was already on his feet. Ears forward, body angled toward the door. Ready. That's the plan, she said, and she hung up before her voice could betray what her training wouldn't let her show, that she was afraid. Not of the quarry, not of the cold, of the silence waiting inside a dead zone where no signal could reach and no one could hear her if the plan went wrong. Coda walked to the door and turned back to look at her. One look. Steady. Warm. Absolute. If you go into the cold, I go too. Nora grabbed her jacket, her weapon, her go-bag. She knelt beside Coda and put her hand on his broad chest, feeling the heartbeat beneath the fur. Strong. Even. The rhythm of an animal who didn't know how to calculate fear, only how to face it. Whatever happens, she said, we stay together. Coda's tail moved once. Not a wag, an oath. They walked out into the dark. The road narrowed 2 miles in, just like Ethan said it would. The signal dropped in steps. 5 bars, 3, 1, nothing. Nora watched the radio indicator flatline and felt the silence fill the vehicle like water rising in a closed room. Not the absence of sound, the presence of something worse. Isolation, manufactured and waiting. Coda sat rigid beside her, his ears strained forward, his nose working the air vents with an intensity that told Nora he was reading something she couldn't see, smell, or name. Every muscle in his body was pulled taut. Not fear. Warning. The physical language of a dog screaming danger through every fiber without making a sound. Nora checked her watch. 14 minutes until the check-in window. She tapped the radio. Static. Tried her phone. Dead screen. No bars, no signal, no lifeline. She pulled onto the shoulder and killed the engine. The silence that followed was absolute. The kind of quiet that felt arranged, curated, like someone had hollowed out this stretch of road specifically so that whatever happened here would happen without witnesses. Stay close, Nora said to Coda. She stepped out. The cold hit her lungs like broken glass. She raised her phone toward the sky, turning slowly, searching for one bar. One signal. One thread connecting her to the world she'd driven away from. Behind her, Coda dropped from the vehicle and hit the ground moving. His nose swept the snow near the rear tire, then snapped toward the tree line so fast his whole body pivoted. The growl came. Low, controlled, vibrating through his chest like a generator spinning up. Nora's hand dropped toward her hip. Her eyes followed Coda's gaze. Nothing. Snow and silence and the shadowed mouths of pines standing too close together. Then movement. Fast. Too fast to be wind. The impact came from the right. A body, heavy, trained, precise, drove into Nora's side and took her off her feet. Her skull cracked against something hard. Stars detonated behind her eyes. She heard Coda explode, a savage, full-throated bark that sounded like fury given a voice. And then a yelp. Sharp. Ugly. The sound of something striking an animal that was trying to save her life. They hurt my dog. That was the last clear thought. Then darkness folded over her like a hand. Back at the command post, Ethan Cross sat in front of a map with a coffee he hadn't tasted and a focus he couldn't hold. Shadow lay at his feet, chin on paws, but the dog's eyes were open and his ears tracked every sound in the building with the restless attention of an animal who knew his handler was worried. Ethan checked the clock. 12 minutes until Nora's check-in. He told himself 12 minutes was nothing. He'd waited longer in worse places for higher stakes. But his body didn't believe his mind, because his body remembered Syria. The building, the stairs, the door he'd kicked open 90 seconds after it mattered. Layla's face. Always Layla's face. He pushed it down, checked the clock again. 11 minutes. Mason Hale walked past the command desk carrying a fresh coffee and a clipboard, looking exactly like a man with nothing to hide. He nodded at Ethan. Ethan nodded back. Shadow's head lifted off his paws. The dog's nostrils flared once, reading Mason's scent trail, and his body went rigid in the same way Coda's did. The same frequency, the same silent alarm. Two dogs who had never trained together arriving at the identical conclusion through independent channels. Mason disappeared into the logistics bay. Shadow's eyes tracked him until the door closed. Then the dog looked at Ethan with an expression that, in a human, would have been, "How many times do I have to tell you?" "I know," Ethan said quietly. "I know." 8 minutes. 7. 6. Ethan's fingers drummed the table once. He stopped them. Drumming was a tell, and tells were weaknesses, and weaknesses got people killed. He breathed, counted, watched the second hand crawl. 5 minutes. 4, 3, 2, 1. The check-in window opened. Ethan picked up the radio. "Cafferty, this is Cross. Check in." Static. "Cafferty, Cross. Confirm status." Static. He waited 30 seconds. The longest 30 seconds of his life since Syria. Then he stood up so fast the chair hit the wall behind him. Shadow was on his feet before the chair stopped moving. "Where's Cafferty?" Ethan said. His voice was quiet. The room heard it anyway, because quiet from a Navy SEAL sounded different than quiet from anyone else. It sounded like the safety being clicked off. The duty officer looked up. She logged a route to the quarry road at 1400. Check-in was scheduled for... She missed it. It's only been... She missed it. Get me her last GPS ping. The duty officer pulled the data. Nora's vehicle had stopped transmitting 2 miles into the dead zone. Last ping? 14 minutes ago. No movement since. Ethan grabbed his keys. Shadow was already at the door. 85 pounds of brown and black German Shepherd. Dark eyes locked on his handler. Body vibrating with the same urgency that was tearing through Ethan's chest like voltage. "Cross, we should follow protocol," the duty officer started. "Protocol says 15-minute window. Window's closed. I'm going." Ethan was through the door before the sentence ended. He drove 12 minutes. Fast, focused, hands locked on the wheel, while Shadow sat upright in the passenger seat, nose pressed to the vent, reading the airstream for information. At the 2-mile mark, where the road narrowed into a drift-choked logging trail, Ethan's vehicle couldn't pass. He killed the engine, opened the door, and ran. Shadow ran beside him. The dog powered through knee-deep snow with the brutal efficiency of an animal built for this. The broad chest cutting a path, the legs driving forward, the brown and black body moving through white like a torpedo through water. Ethan had given one command at the trailhead. Find. Shadow didn't need to be told what to find. He already knew. The chemical signature of canine distress, Coda's fear, was in the air. Carried on wind so cold it turned Ethan's lungs into razor blades. At the 1/4-mile mark, Shadow's head snapped left. The dog changed direction mid-stride, veering hard toward a depression in the terrain. Ethan followed, legs burning, breath coming in ragged clouds. They crested a ridge, and Ethan saw Nora's vehicle. Doors open, engine off, empty. His stomach dropped. Syria flashed. The building, the silence, the door. Shadow didn't stop at the vehicle. He blew past it, nose down, locked on a trail that led away from the road toward the old quarry. Ethan followed. Trust the dog. Always trust the dog. That was the one lesson combat had burned into him deeper than any other. 300 yards. Shadow's pace increased. The dog was whining now, a high, thin sound Ethan had heard exactly once before. In Syria, at the building. When they'd arrived too late. Not this time. Not this time. Not this time. Shadow crested the quarry rim and stopped. Rigid. Every muscle locked. His eyes fixed on something below. Ethan reached the rim and looked down. 2 shapes broke the white surface. Coda's sable ears first, dark points against the snow. Then Nora's dark auburn hair, her face, her eyes above the black tape, open, alive, locked onto Ethan with an intensity that hit him harder than any round he'd ever taken. Alive. She's alive. For one heartbeat, one fraction of a second, he saw Layla's face where Nora's was. The ghost overlapped the living. Then Coda barked, muffled by tape, but ferocious. A sound that shattered the ghost and replaced it with the present. A sound that said, "Stop looking, start digging." Ethan dropped into the quarry. His knees hit packed snow. His bare hands started clawing. No gloves, no tools, just skin and adrenaline and the furious refusal to let this moment end the way Syria had ended. Shadow dug beside him, paws throwing arcs of white, the high whine escalating into something that sounded almost human. Coda first, nearest casualty. Ethan's knife sliced the tape from the dog's muzzle. Coda inhaled so hard his entire body convulsed, a drowning animal pulling air like it was being dragged from the bottom of an ocean. One bark. Raw, shattered. Not aggression. Relief breaking in half. Then, immediately, before Ethan could pull him free, Coda turned his head toward Nora and whined. Low, desperate, pointing. Her. Get her. Now. Ethan lunged. His hands ripped snow from Nora's chest, shoulders, arms. Shadow circled behind her and dug from the back, working the frozen pack away from the ropes. Ethan sliced the tape from Nora's mouth, and the breath she took sounded like something being torn from the earth. Violent. Primal. The sound of a woman refusing to die. "Rope," she gasped. One word, all her body could produce. He cut it. Her arms fell forward, blue-fingered, shaking. She collapsed against the snow wall, teeth chattering so hard the sound echoed off the quarry walls. But she didn't cry. She reached for Coda. The dog was still half buried, still fighting free, and when Nora's hand found his head, he shoved against her palm hard enough to nearly knock her over. Not tenderness. Fury. The language of a dog saying, "Never again. Do you hear me? Never again." Nora pressed her forehead against his. "I know," she whispered. "I'm sorry. I know." Ethan freed Coda from the snow. The dog staggered out, shook once, a full-body tremor, and immediately positioned himself in front of Nora. Guarding. Half frozen, bleeding from a cut above his eye, tape glue still on his muzzle. Guarding. Shadow stood at the quarry perimeter, facing the tree line, ears forward. Nobody told him to. He'd assessed the scene, identified that his handler was occupied with rescue, and placed himself on watch. 2 dogs, 2 different worlds, the same instinct. Ethan wrapped his NWU jacket around Nora's shoulders. She shook too hard to put her arms through. For 3 seconds she leaned against him. Not weakness, necessity, then pulled back. Her eyes went hard. The FBI agent returned. "Boot prints," she said through chattering teeth. "Tactical tread. 2 sets. Zip tie fragments near the rim. Contract grade. Military supply chain." Ethan stared at her. She'd been buried alive for over an hour, and her first words were evidence analysis. "Mason," he said. Nora's jaw locked. "He built the tip. He knew my route. He knew the dead zone. He knew my check-in window." She looked at Coda, then at Shadow, then at Ethan. "He tried to kill me and my dog to protect a trafficking network. And right now, he's sitting in the command post, waiting for someone to find our bodies." Ethan's expression didn't change, but his eyes emptied of everything except one thing. A decision so absolute, it made the air around him feel heavier. "Then let's make sure the last thing he sees is us walking back in." He helped her to her feet. She swayed, steadied. Coda pressed against her left leg. Shadow fell in at Ethan's right. 4 figures in the snow, 2 humans, 2 dogs, moving toward the road. Nora stopped once. She looked back at the quarry, at the 2 holes in the snow where she and Coda had been entombed, at the boot prints leading away from a man who believed he'd won. "He doesn't know we're alive," she said. Ethan looked at her. Something passed between them. Not romance, not attraction. Something harder and more useful. The shared understanding of 2 people who had just become the most dangerous thing a traitor could face. Witnesses. "Good," Ethan said. "Let's keep it that way as long as we can." They reached his vehicle. Nora sat in the passenger seat with Coda across her lap. Too big, too heavy, absolutely refusing to be anywhere else. Shadow watched the tree line through the rear window, still guarding, always guarding. Nora took 1 sip of water, then another. The shaking slowed. Her mind cleared, and behind her eyes, the case rebuilt itself. Not as a puzzle anymore, but as a weapon. She knew who, she knew how, she knew why. And she had the one thing Mason Hale hadn't planned for. She was alive to prove it. They didn't go back to command. Ethan drove past the turnoff without slowing, and Nora didn't ask why, because she already understood. The command post was Mason's territory. Every screen, every log, every radio channel ran through infrastructure he had access to. Going back meant walking into his house and hoping he wouldn't notice the dead woman sitting at his table. "The church," Nora said. "The church," Ethan confirmed. Pastor Jim Sutton opened the door before the headlights died. He took one look at Nora, the bruised wrists, the blue fingernails, the tape burns on her cheeks, and his face did something Nora had only seen on men who understood suffering as a professional language. It went still, then soft, then hard, all in the space of a single breath. "Rachel's asleep in the back," Jim said quietly. "Shoes still on." Nora nodded. She knew what shoes on sleeping meant. Rachel Voss was still ready to run. Even in her dreams, the door was never far enough away. They moved inside. Coda went first, nose working the threshold, the walls, the air, clearing the space the way he cleared every space, with the meticulous discipline of a dog who had learned that danger rarely announced itself with noise. Shadow followed, mirroring Coda's sweep from the opposite direction. Two dogs who had never trained together, working a room in perfect tandem because the instinct was the same. "I need your safe," Nora said to Jim. "Behind the painting. Snow-covered shepherd. Old steel, but it holds." "If I put evidence in there, you become a target." Jim looked at the lockbox in Nora's hands, then at Coda, still carrying dried blood above his eye. Then back at Nora, with eyes that held the steady gentleness of a man who had spent his entire adult life opening doors for people the world wanted to keep out. "I became a target the night Rachel knocked," he said. "This just gives it paperwork." Nora placed the lockbox in the safe. Rachel's original testimony, the backup USB, every altered file she'd documented, every timestamp discrepancy, every chain of custody irregularity that pointed at Mason Hale like a compass needle pointing north. Jim closed it, spun the lock, and moved the painting back. Hazel Briggs arrived 19 minutes later. She carried soup, fury, and a diner receipt with 3 license plates written in handwriting so bold it looked like someone had punched the paper with a pen. She set the thermos down, looked at Nora's wrists, and said, "That clipboard boy did this." Nora stared at her. "How did you—" "Honey, I've run a diner for 30 years. I know the difference between a man who smiles because he means it and a man who smiles because he's measuring the room. That boy smiled like he was counting exits every time he walked in." Hazel pushed the soup forward. "Drink first, then we plan." Nora drank. Then she called the task force commander on Ethan's secure line. She reported the attempted murder of a federal agent and her canine partner. She named Mason Hale. She requested immediate access revocation and an accelerated raid on Crown of Pines before Mason could warn the compound. The commander listened, verified with Ethan, processed the request in the clipped, controlled language of a man whose job was to make decisions that kept people alive. "Access revoked, as of 2,247 hours, the commander said. "Raid moves to 0600. Can your evidence survive until then?" "It's in a church safe, guarded by a pastor, a diner owner, a Navy SEAL, and 2 German shepherds." A pause. "That'll do." Nora hung up and looked at the clock. 11 hours. Mason Hale had 11 hours before the world he'd built collapsed around him. The question was, what he'd do with them. The answer came at 0134. Shadow's head snapped toward the east wall. No transition, flat to standing in a single motion, like a switch being thrown. His growl came low and deep, vibrating through the floorboards, hard enough that Nora felt it in her teeth. Coda answered from across the room. Same pitch, same frequency. 2 dogs locked on the same threat through different walls, triangulating danger the way sonar triangulated submarines. Ethan moved to the window. His body changed, the civilian posture dropping away, replaced by something harder, something trained into the muscle and bone by years of operating in places where the wrong step meant a body bag. "Two figures," he said. "East side, moving toward the back door." "Lockbox or Rachel?" Nora said. "Both, probably." "Jim, Rachel, now." Pastor Jim didn't argue. He moved down the hallway with a speed that surprised Nora, the stride of a man who had worked disaster relief long enough to know that hesitation and death wore the same face. She heard him open the back room door, heard Rachel's sharp gasp, heard Jim's voice, low, steady, the practiced calm of a man who knew that the first thing a frightened person needed wasn't information, but tone. "Behind the filing cabinets, stay low. Don't move until you hear Nora's voice." A thump hit the side door. Hard, deliberate. Stained glass shivered, scattering colored light across the floor like someone had shattered a prayer. Hazel grabbed a cast-iron skillet from the kitchen counter. Nora didn't have time to tell her to put it down. Didn't want to, either. Metal scratched the lock. Not a key, a tool. The scratch became a grind, then a crack, and the door split inward. Two men, covered faces, dark jackets, practiced movements, the kind that came from repetition, not training manuals. One carried a duffel bag, the other gripped a crowbar that caught the hallway light. "Stop," Ethan said. He stepped into the aisle, and his voice filled the church the way a bell fills a tower. Not loud, but total. "Now!" They didn't stop. The first one lunged toward the office hallway, toward the safe, toward Rachel. The second swung the crowbar at Ethan's head in a wide arc designed to end conversations permanently. Ethan ducked the swing the way a man ducks something he's dodged 1,000 times. Controlled, efficient, the motion costing him nothing. His counter was faster than the swing itself. One strike to the wrist. The crowbar clattered across the floor. A second strike put the man against a pew so hard the wood cracked. Shadow hit the second intruder before he reached the hallway. The German Shepherd launched from standing, 85 pounds of focused aggression, and took the man down at the waist. The intruder screamed. Shadow's jaw locked on his forearm. Not shaking, not tearing, holding. Controlled force applied with surgical precision. "Shadow, hold," Ethan commanded. The dog held. But the first man, the one Ethan had driven into the pew, scrambled sideways and knocked a candle display off a shelf. 2 pillar candles hit a stack of paper flyers. Flame touched paper. Paper touched wood. Fire bloomed with a hunger that turned the air toxic in 3 seconds. Smoke rolled across the ceiling and dropped. Fast. Thick. Nora's eyes burned, her lungs seized. The church, shelter, safe house, last refuge, was filling with poison. "Jim!" Nora shouted. A cough answered from the back hallway. Violent, racking, the sound of lungs being crushed by smoke. Nora moved toward the hall, but the heat pushed back. A wall of scorching air that turned the corridor into a furnace. She couldn't see, couldn't breathe. Her hands found the wall and she pressed forward, but her body was already failing. The quarry's cold still in her bones, her reserves already spent. Coda passed her. The dog didn't hesitate, didn't wait for a command. He bolted into the smoke with his nose down, ears flat, body low, moving on instinct and scent toward the one thing that mattered. Nora heard him bark. Twice. Short, sharp bursts that cut through the roar of flame like a blade through cloth. Then the sound of claws on wood. Then a heavier sound. Dragging. Pulling. Coda had found Pastor Jim collapsed in the hallway, overcome by smoke. The dog clamped his teeth on Jim's sleeve and hauled. Not hard enough to tear, hard enough to move a man who couldn't move himself. Inch by inch, through smoke so thick the world had turned to gray, Nora followed the barking. Her hand found Jim's arm. She pulled. Ethan appeared behind her and grabbed Jim's other side. Together, they hauled the pastor out through the back door into cold air that rushed into their lungs like mercy made physical. Jim collapsed to his knees, coughing so hard his body convulsed. Coda stood over him, chest heaving, soot on his muzzle, amber eyes fierce. Then the dog nudged Jim's shoulder. Once. A gesture that lived somewhere between scolding and tenderness. The canine version of, "You're alive. Don't make me do that again." "Rachel," Jim gasped. "She's out," Ethan said. He'd pulled Rachel through a window, blanket and all, and she was standing in the snow, barefoot, shaking. Alive. Shadow stood beside her, pressing his body against her legs, keeping her upright by force of loyalty. The intruders were gone. Sirens approached, thin and distant, but growing. The fire climbed the east wall and punched through the roof, sending embers spiraling into the black sky. Nora walked to the east side of the church and looked at the tire tracks in the snow. Deep tread, contractor vehicle. The same pattern she'd cataloged from the quarry. Ethan appeared beside her. Both dogs flanked them, Coda on Nora's left, Shadow on Ethan's right. "Mason," Nora said. "He's panicking. He knows the raid is coming, and he's burning bridges. He'll go for the compound next. Try to reach Crane's people and destroy the physical evidence before 0600. Nora's phone buzzed. "Task Force Commander." She answered. "Cafferty, Mason Hale attempted to use his revoked credentials to access the evidence storage depot 15 minutes ago. System flagged it and locked him out. He's trying to erase the trail." "We know. Federal warrant issued for his arrest. Raid holds at 0600. Can you hold?" Nora looked at the church. Smoke pouring from broken windows. Jim on the steps, with Hazel's coat around his shoulders and Coda's head in his lap. Rachel, barefoot in the snow, wrapped in a blanket. Alive because a dog had pulled a man through smoke who had pulled her through fear. Hazel stood behind them all, cast-iron skillet still in her hand, looking at the burning church with an expression that wasn't grief. It was rage, the clean, useful kind. The kind that rebuilds what fury tears down. "We'll hold," Nora said. She hung up and looked at Ethan. 5 hours, she said. Then this ends. Ethan looked at the road leading toward Crown of Pines. Then at Shadow, who looked back at him with dark, steady eyes that held no hesitation. Then at Coda, who stood at Nora's side, soot-covered, bleeding, exhausted, and absolutely refusing to be anywhere else. "It ends," Ethan said, "but not the way Mason planned." 4 figures stood in the snow between a burning church and a frozen road. 2 humans and 2 dogs. Behind them, a pastor breathing through damaged lungs. A diner owner holding a skillet like a weapon. A trafficking survivor standing barefoot in the cold because freedom sometimes meant feeling every sharp thing the ground had to offer. And somewhere between the church and the compound, Mason Hale was running out of time, running out of road, and running out of the one thing that had protected him since the beginning. The assumption that no one was watching. Everyone was watching now. The raid launched at 600 into a darkness so complete that Nora felt it pressing against the vehicle windows like something alive. She sat in the second truck with Coda beside her, the dog's amber eyes catching dashboard glow. His body carrying a new kind of tension, tighter, harder, the posture of an animal who had been buried and burned and beaten in the span of 24 hours, and had decided that nothing on the surface of the earth would ever catch him off guard again. Ethan led the convoy. His NWU Type 3 was pressed and clean, the digital green and brown camouflage sharp against his frame. Shadow sat in the passenger seat beside him, dark eyes forward, tactical harness on. The leather collar was packed away. This was operational now. Both dog and handler knew the difference between waiting and moving, and they had been waiting long enough. The task force advanced in phased steps, controlled, deliberate. Every vehicle spaced, every team assigned a sector. The explosives risk turned every decision into arithmetic. Too fast meant detonation. Too slow meant Mason reaching the evidence first. Nora had briefed the teams on the storage zones she'd mapped from Pastor Jim's decoded sermon fragments. The cellar where the old spirits rest. Underground storage, north building. Lamps that must never go dark. 24-hour surveillance points. Sealed rooms where the faithful wait. Holding zones for trafficked victims. The sermons of a false prophet translated into warrants by a real one. Crown of Pines didn't resist. That was the part nobody expected. The gates opened. The buildings were quiet. The followers, 37 of them, ranging from genuinely devoted to genuinely trapped, emerged with their hands visible and their faces blank. The expression of people who had been told the outside world was the enemy and were now watching the enemy walk through their front door with badges and calm voices. Elias Crane stood in the main hall, white shirt, folded hands. A face arranged into serenity, the way a stage is arranged for a performance. He spoke before anyone addressed him. "This is a house of faith. You are violating sanctified ground." The lead ATF agent didn't break stride. "Elias Crane, you are under arrest. Federal warrant. Trafficking, contraband, conspiracy, accessory to attempted murder of a federal agent." Crane's composure cracked. Not a collapse. A fracture, visible only in the corners. A tremor at his mouth. A tightening around his eyes. The micro-expressions of a man hearing words he had convinced himself could never be spoken inside his own walls. "I want to speak to my attorney," Crane said. "You'll have that right. Step forward." Crane didn't step forward. His eyes swept the agents behind the lead. Searching faces, counting, calculating. Nora watched him search and knew exactly who he was looking for. Mason. He was looking for Mason. Mason wasn't there. Nora entered with Coda. The dog's nose hit the air and his body dropped into work mode. Mechanical, precise. Every surface cataloged in scent. He alerted 30 seconds in. A door along the north corridor, exactly where Jim's map said the underground storage would be. Agents moved in behind Coda and found it. Contraband, bundled tight. Materials that justified every cautious decision the task force had spent a month debating. Enough to put Crane away for decades. But that wasn't what stopped Nora's heart. In a basement room that Crane had called the Sanctuary, the sealed room where the faithful wait, they found the trafficking evidence. Transit logs, route maps, photographs, names, dates. A pipeline that had moved human beings through this compound like inventory through a warehouse. Documented with the cold efficiency of a man who believed God had given him permission. Nora looked at the photographs. She didn't let herself look away. She owed every face in those images the dignity of being seen. One photograph was Rachel Voss, younger, thinner, but the same eyes, already carrying the haunted alertness of a woman calculating the distance to every door in the room. Rachel had survived this place. She had walked into the cold and chosen running over kneeling. And now her testimony, backed by these records, would ensure that the door she'd escaped through would open for everyone still trapped inside. "Cafferty," Ethan's voice came through the radio. Tight. Clipped. The voice he used when tactical calm was covering something urgent. "North perimeter. We have a runner." Nora's pulse surged. "Mason?" "Contractor vehicle. No headlights. Service road. North side. He's trying to reach the evidence depot from the back." "He doesn't know his access is revoked." "He's about to find out, but I need to get there before he decides to use a match instead of a keycard." "Go." Ethan went. Shadow went with him. They cut through the north tree line at a dead sprint, handler and dog moving through darkness and snow with the synchronized precision of two beings who had been running toward danger together for years. Shadow's nose caught Mason's scent at 50 yards. The dog's body shifted, from running to tracking to hunting, the transition so smooth it looked like a single continuous motion. Mason had abandoned his vehicle where the service road ended and was moving on foot toward a maintenance hatch that would give him access to the compound's underground storage. The same storage Coda had just flagged from the inside. If Mason reached it, he could destroy physical evidence that no digital backup could replace. He didn't reach it. Shadow intercepted him at the tree line. The dog materialized from darkness like something the night had manufactured. 85 pounds of brown and black muscle appearing in Mason's path with the quiet inevitability of a locked door. No bark, no growl, just presence. The kind of presence that made a man's legs stop moving before his brain caught up. Mason stumbled backward. His hands came up, and in the half-second before Ethan reached them, something happened in Mason's face that Nora, arriving 30 seconds later with Coda, would remember for the rest of her career. Mason looked at Shadow and understood. Not the tactical situation, not the legal consequences. Something deeper and older. The dog had known. From the first day. From the first time Mason had walked through the command post with his clipboard and his clean smile and his carefully rehearsed friendliness. Shadow had read him the way dogs read everything. Not by words or credentials or history, but by what a person was underneath all of it. And Mason Hale, underneath all of it, was a man who smelled wrong. "On the ground," Ethan said. His voice carried nothing. Not anger, not satisfaction. Not the grief that Nora knew was grinding behind his eyes. Just the flat authority of a man completing a mission. Mason dropped to his knees. "Ethan, listen. You don't understand what's happening here. Hands behind your back." "We served together. You know me. This isn't what it looks like." "I knew someone who wore your face. Hands behind your back. I won't ask again." Something in Mason broke. Not the polite mask. That had already dissolved. What broke was deeper. The architecture of the lie he'd been living. The scaffolding of justifications and rationalizations that had allowed him to betray every person who trusted him while sleeping soundly. It collapsed in his eyes, and what was left was fear. Raw, cornered, animal fear. The kind that comes when a man who calculated everything realizes he forgot the one variable that mattered. The dogs. Ethan cuffed him. Shadow stood 3 feet away, motionless, eyes locked on Mason with an intensity that made the handcuffs feel like a formality. Mason went quiet for a long time. Then he said something that made Ethan's jaw clench so hard the muscle jumped. She was supposed to die in that quarry. It was clean, no signal, no witnesses. The snow would have covered it by morning. Nobody would have found her until spring. Nora was standing 10 feet away. She heard every word. Coda heard them too. Not the meaning, but the tone. The cold, factual recitation of a man describing her murder the way someone describes a logistics plan. The dog's body went rigid against her leg, and the growl that formed in his chest was low and absolute, the sound of an animal who understood threat not through language, but through the vibration of cruelty in a human voice. Ethan turned Mason over to the federal agents. He didn't speak. He didn't look at Mason again. He walked away with Shadow pressed against his leg, and Nora saw his hands, steady, controlled, disciplined hands, that had dug her out of the snow with bare fingers, shaking. She followed him. Found him at the edge of the tree line, one hand on Shadow's head, staring at nothing. "You didn't lose it," she said. "I wanted to." "I know. You didn't. That matters." Ethan looked at her. His eyes were wet. Not crying. Men like Ethan didn't cry in operational environments. But the moisture was there, a thin film of something that had been locked away for 3 years and had finally found a crack to seep through. "In Syria," he said. "The interpreter. Layla. She was taken because someone on our side gave her location to the enemy. Someone inside the team. I never proved it, but I knew." He looked at Shadow. He knew, before I did. The same way he knew about Mason. The same way Coda knew. Nora was quiet. She let him talk. Some things needed air more than they needed answers. "I got there 90 seconds too late," Ethan said. 90 seconds. I've counted them every day since. And today, driving to that quarry, I was counting them again. Every second between the check-in window closing and finding you was a second I was reliving that hallway in Syria. "But you got there," Nora said. "Barely." "Barely counts. Barely is the difference between a funeral and a conversation." Ethan looked at her for a long time, then at Shadow, who was leaning against his leg with the quiet pressure of a dog who knew when his handler needed weight more than words. Then at Coda, sitting beside Nora with soot on his coat and dried blood above his eye, and a steadiness that defied everything he'd been through. "She wrote me a letter," Ethan said. "Layla, before the mission, in case she didn't make it." "What did it say?" Ethan reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper so creased and soft it looked like it had been carried through every day of the last 3 years. He held it, but didn't open it. It said, "Don't carry my death as your failure. Carry it as your reason. Every person you save after me is proof that I mattered." Nora's throat tightened. She looked at the letter in his hand, at the evidence of a dead woman's grace living in a soldier's pocket. And she understood something about Ethan Cross that no file or briefing could have told her. He hadn't come to Minnesota for a mission. He'd come to keep a promise. "You weren't too late this time," she said. Ethan folded the letter and put it back against his chest. "No," he said. "We weren't." Behind them, the compound was being emptied. Followers escorted out. Evidence catalogued. Crane loaded into a federal vehicle with the stunned expression of a man who had believed his own mythology until reality walked through his gate with warrants. Nora's phone rang. Diane Marsh, the federal prosecutor assigned to the case. Her voice was sharp and focused. "Cafferty, we just picked up Judge Durning at his office. He was feeding documents into a shredder that jammed 20 minutes before we arrived. Half the evidence was still intact." "How much did he destroy?" "Not enough. Not nearly enough. The original chain is solid. Rachel's testimony, your documentation, the storage footage, the altered evidence trail. It all holds. Mason Hale is looking at 14 federal charges. Crane at 22. Durning at 9. And we've identified 6 trafficking victims still inside the compound who are now in federal protective custody. 6. 6 people who had been trapped behind hymns and locked doors and the smiling authority of a man who used God as camouflage. 6 people who were breathing free air tonight because a diner owner wrote down license plates, and a pastor remembered sermons, and a dog refused to stop growling at a man with a clipboard. "Thank you," Nora said. The words felt too small. "Don't thank me. Thank your dog. And tell that seal his timing was impeccable." Nora hung up and looked across the compound to where Ethan stood with Shadow. The dog sat at perfect attention beside his handler, brown and black coat catching the first gray light of dawn, dark eyes forward, tactical harness fitted like armor earned through service. Coda sat beside Nora, soot-covered, battered, exhausted, still guarding. 2 handlers, 2 dogs, 2 German shepherds who had been trained in different programs, bonded to different humans, shaped by different missions, and who had, in the space of 72 hours, saved each other's people through nothing more than instinct, trust, and the stubborn refusal to stop working when the world demanded they quit. Nora put her hand on Coda's head. The dog leaned into her palm, and the warmth of him, alive, steady, unbroken, was the most honest thing she'd felt in weeks. "Good boy," she whispered. "The best boy." Coda's tail moved once, not a wag, an answer. The case became paperwork. That was the part nobody warned you about. The slow, grinding machinery of justice that replaced adrenaline with fluorescent lights and replaced urgency with repetition. Nora testified for 4 days. She sat in a federal courtroom and described the altered evidence, the fabricated tip, the dead zone, the burial, the rescue. She described Coda's alertness from the first moment Mason entered the command post. She described the tape across her dog's muzzle, and the cut above his eye, and the way he'd blinked at her in the snow. Slow, deliberate, steady, while the cold tried to drag them both under. The courtroom went silent during that part. Not the restless silence of bored jurors, the heavy silence of people listening with something deeper than their ears. The prosecutor asked her, "Agent Cafferty, in your professional assessment, what role did your canine partner play in the identification of the internal threat?" Nora looked across the room at Coda, lying at a handler station near the gallery, visible through the glass partition. His amber eyes were fixed on her, still watching, always watching. Coda identified Mason Hale as a threat before any evidence, any data analysis, or any human instinct caught up, Nora said. He placed his body between me and that man on the first day. He never stopped. Every alert he gave was correct. Every reaction was justified by evidence we discovered later. My dog knew the truth before the system did, and if I had listened to him sooner, I might not have ended up buried in a quarry. The courtroom was quiet again. The judge wrote something down. A juror in the second row wiped her eyes. Pastor Jim testified next. His voice still carried the rough edge of smoke damage, a cough that surfaced every few sentences, the ghost of a fire set by men who wanted to burn the truth along with the building that sheltered it. He described Rachel's arrival, the coded sermons, the church attack, Coda pulling him through smoke by his sleeve. The prosecutor asked why he had risked his life to shelter a stranger. Jim was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because that's what the door is for. You open it. If you only open it for people who are safe, it's not a door. It's a filter. And God didn't build churches to be filters." Hazel Briggs took the stand with the energy of a woman who had been waiting 64 years for someone to ask her opinion under oath. She spread her diner receipts on the witness table. Dates, plates, times, directions, all written in bold handwriting on grease-stained paper. The prosecutor asked why she had tracked the vehicles. "Because something felt wrong," Hazel said. And where I come from, when something feels wrong, you don't wait for somebody with a badge to notice. You write it down. You pay attention. You tell somebody who'll listen." She paused and looked directly at the jury. "I'm a diner owner, not a detective. But I've got eyes, and I've got a pen. And I've got the good sense God gave a woman who's been lied to enough times to know the smell of it." 3 jurors nodded. The judge didn't stop them. Rachel Voss testified last. Her hands trembled on the witness table. Her voice cracked on the second sentence, and she stopped, eyes closing, breath shuddering. The courtroom waited. Nobody rushed her. Nobody told her to take her time. They just waited, because some silences deserve patience. Rachel opened her eyes. She looked through the glass partition at Coda. The dog met her gaze, the way he'd met it in the church that first night. Steady, warm, present. Rachel's shoulders straightened. Half an inch. Enough. She told the truth about Crown of Pines, about the trafficking, the control, the fear, about walking into the cold with groceries in her arms and deciding that dying free was better than living owned. Her voice trembled, but it didn't break. Not once. Not when the defense attorney challenged her timeline. Not when Crane stared at her from the defendant's table with eyes that still believed they carried power. Not even when she described the room, the sanctuary, where she had been kept for 11 months. Afterward, in the hallway, Rachel found Nora. "He watched me the whole time," Rachel said. "Your dog. Through the glass. The entire testimony." "He does that," Nora said. "He watches people who are being brave." Rachel's eyes filled. She didn't wipe them. "Nobody's ever called me brave before." "Get used to it." Rachel looked down at Coda. The dog sat at Nora's feet, calm, patient, his amber eyes holding the same gentle certainty they'd held when Rachel had first sat beside him on a church floor and gripped his fur like the edge of a lifeboat. "Can I?" Rachel asked. Nora nodded. Rachel knelt and put her arms around Coda's neck. The dog leaned into her, giving weight, giving warmth, giving the wordless promise that animals give to broken humans when language fails. Rachel buried her face in his fur and stayed there for a long time. When she stood up, her cheeks were wet, but her jaw was set. "I'm going to be okay," Rachel said. Not a question, a decision. "Yes," Nora said. "You are." The verdicts came down 4 weeks later. Mason Hale, 14 federal charges, guilty on all counts. Conspiracy, evidence tampering, attempted murder of a federal agent, accessory to trafficking. His face went blank when the foreman read the word guilty for the 14th time, as if repetition had finally penetrated the wall he'd built between himself and consequence. Elias Crane, 22 charges. Guilty. He tried to speak after the verdict. The judge told him to sit down. He sat. The man who had preached about sealed rooms and faithful waiting was now going to experience both, courtesy of the federal prison system. Judge Durning, 9 charges. Guilty. He was arrested trying to shred documents. Convicted, trying to shred his legacy. The shredder had jammed. The metaphor wrote itself. 6 trafficking victims were placed in federal protective custody and connected to survivor advocacy programs. 6 people who had been hidden behind hymns and locked doors now had names in a system designed to protect them instead of erase them. Nora read the victim impact statements alone in her office. Coda lay at her feet. She read every word. She owed them that. 6 months passed. The task force dissolved. Nora returned to Minneapolis. Life resumed its ordinary patterns, except ordinary felt different now. Lighter in some places, heavier in others, rearranged in ways she was still learning to navigate. Coda retired from active field service. Policy and mercy, and the simple biological truth that a dog who had been buried alive, smoke-damaged, and beaten in a 72-hour span had earned the right to sleep in on Tuesday mornings. Nora signed the adoption papers at a desk in the FBI's Minneapolis field office. The clerk smiled and said, "Congratulations, he's officially yours." "He was always mine," Nora said. "This just makes the paperwork honest." Coda moved into her home the way a dog moves into a place he's been waiting for. Immediately. Completely. Without hesitation. He slept at the foot of her bed. He still growled when strangers came too close. And on Sunday mornings, he lay on the steps of Pastor Jim's rebuilt church, guarding the entrance with the dignified stillness of a retired soldier who understood that sacred places needed protection, even in peacetime. The church had been rebuilt in 4 months. The congregation raised the money. The new walls were stronger. The new door was wider. And above it, a small brass plaque read, "This door stays open." Jim scratched behind Coda's ears every Sunday morning. "You were an answer," he said each time, in a voice aimed at God as much as the dog. Coda would flick an ear and accept the compliment the way he accepted everything, with patience and without ego. Hazel pinned a handwritten sign in the diner window. "If you need help, this is a safe place to ask." She still wrote license plates on receipts. Old habits built on stubbornness and sharp eyes didn't die. They just got more useful. Rachel Voss entered a survivor support program. 6 months after the trial, she sent Nora a card. 4 words on the inside. "I sleep without shoes now." Nora read it 3 times. Then she put it on her refrigerator next to Coda's adoption certificate, because some victories were too small for headlines and too large for anything except the place where a person actually lived. Ethan transitioned to a training role, teaching Joint Task Force teams canine integration and rescue protocols at a facility outside Duluth. Shadow stayed with him. The dog was slowing down. Gray crept into his muzzle. His mornings started stiff and took longer to warm up. But his eyes were still sharp, still measuring every room he entered, and his loyalty was still the most absolute force in Ethan's life. On cold mornings, when Ethan ran training exercises, Shadow watched from the sideline with an expression that said, "I taught you everything you know. Don't embarrass me in front of the new dogs." The rebuilt church held a ceremony on a bright winter afternoon. Coda and Shadow both received community honors, framed citations, and small medals that caught the light when they moved. The congregation filled the pews. Hazel sat in the front row, arms crossed, looking proud in a way that dared anyone to call it sentimental. Jim stood at the altar and read a passage about faithfulness, then looked at both dogs and said, "I've preached about loyalty my entire life. These 2 lived it." The audience clapped. Coda tilted his head at the applause, genuinely confused, which made everyone laugh, which made Nora's eyes sting, because laughter, after everything they'd been through, felt like sunlight hitting a bruise, painful and healing at the same time. Shadow sat perfectly still and accepted the recognition the way a general accepts a salute, with dignity, without needing it. Afterward, Nora and Ethan stood on the church steps. Coda and Shadow lay side by side on the porch. 2 German shepherds, 2 different handlers, united by a mission that had tested every limit both species could reach. "You never showed me the letter," Nora said. Ethan reached into his jacket. The paper was so worn it felt like cloth. He handed it to her. Nora read Layla's handwriting, small, careful, written in a language that wasn't her first, but had become her truest. "Don't carry my death as your failure. Carry it as your reason. Every person you save after me is proof that I mattered. Nora folded the letter and gave it back. Her throat was tight. She was right. She usually was. You saved my life, Ethan. You and Shadow. 90 seconds made the difference 3 years ago. And the same 90 seconds made the difference again. Except this time, you were on the right side of the clock. Ethan looked at Shadow. The old dog lifted his head and met his handler's gaze with dark eyes that held 3 years of shared grief, shared missions, shared silence, and the quiet understanding that the only thing worse than arriving too late was never arriving at all. Layla would have liked you, Ethan said. I would have liked her. She would have loved Coda. He paused. She would have said something like, that dog listens the way God listens, quietly, and when it matters most. Nora looked at Coda. The dog looked back at her with amber eyes that carried no past and no future. Only the steady, uncomplicated present of an animal who measured the world not by what had happened, but by what was needed right now. And right now, his handler was standing in the cold, and his job was to be beside her. That was always his job. He had never once failed it. Come on, Nora said. Let's go home. Coda stood. Shadow stood. Ethan fell into step beside Nora, and the 4 of them walked down the church steps into winter light that turned the snow into something that looked less like the enemy that had tried to kill them, and more like the quiet, forgiving landscape it had always been. Sometimes we wait for miracles to arrive with thunder, with bright signs written across the sky that cannot be ignored. But the truth is quieter, and often kinder. Sometimes a miracle is a woman who keeps breathing when the snow tries to steal her lungs. Sometimes it is a man who runs toward the worst place on earth because he swore he would never count 90 seconds again. And sometimes it is a loyal dog who places his body between the people he loves and the darkness that wants to consume them and refuses to move. Evil hides behind clean smiles and polished credentials and handshakes that feel right until they don't. That is why wisdom matters. Slow decisions, verified evidence, honest people who refuse to rush when rushing gets people buried. But kindness matters just as much. A diner owner who writes down what she sees. A pastor who opens his door at midnight. A neighbor who pays attention, because attention is the first form of love. In the end, it was not one hero who saved the day. It was a chain of goodness, link by link, holding strong when fear tried to shatter it. A retired Navy SEAL who carried a dead woman's letter like a compass. An FBI agent who trusted her dog when the system failed. A trafficking survivor who chose running over kneeling. A 64-year-old woman with a pen and a pie receipt. A pastor who believed that doors exist to be opened. And 2 dogs. 2 German shepherds who never lied, never calculated, never negotiated with their own conscience. They felt what was true. They acted. And they saved lives that the system had nearly lost. If a loyal animal can show that kind of courage, surely we can learn to be a little braver in our own ordinary days. Check on a neighbor. Speak up when something feels wrong. Offer help before someone has to beg for it. Choose compassion, even when it costs you comfort. Write it down when the world wants you to look away. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear that they are not alone tonight. Subscribe so more stories of courage and quiet heroism can reach the people who need them most. And if you believe that God still works through patience, through faithfulness, and through the steady loyalty of those who refuse to leave our side, comment, Amen. May God bless you, keep you safe, and bring you warmth in every season of your life. You are not alone. You were never alone. And the truth, once it starts moving, does not stop.